Hei og velkommen til Motmakts arrangement her på Litteraturhuset. Noam Chomsky, hinsides statssosialismen. Som dere vet vi så heldige at vi har fått professor Noam Chomsky med oss på en liten seanse her I kveld, med temaet frihetlig sosialisme og frihetlig organisering. Mange av dere som kjenner til Noam Chomsky sikkert klar over at han I tillegg til å være professor I lingvistikk, også frihetlig sosialist, akkurat som oss I Motmakt. Derfor vi selvfølgelig glade og stolte over å ha ham her I kveld. Det som skal skje her I kveld at Chomsky vil delta I en samtale med Adrien Wilkins fra Motmakt. Og de skal ha en samtale som foregår I snau 1,5 time, og vi får tid til 3 spørsmål fra salen. Alle som her I kveld har fått tilbud om å stille spørsmål til Chomsky, og vi har plukket ut 3 personer som får gjøre det når selve samtalen over. Vi har et veldig strengt skjema og forsinkelser, så det blir ikke tid til flere spørsmål. Og til sist, etter arrangementet så må dere sjekke ut bokbordet vårt ute på gangen, hvor vi selger masse spennende Chomsky-titler og andre kule bøker. Så da gjenstår det bare for meg å ønske hjertelig velkommen til professor Noam Chomsky.
Well-timed entrance.
Hi and welcome. First of all, I'd like to thank you for joining us here today. Whoop, is that all right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, cool. I'm just going to go start really right on there since we've lost some time. You've repeatedly defined anarchism as the view that the burden of proof is on the authority, and if that burden fails to be met, then the authority is illegitimate and should be dismantled. But you also seem to use the terms Anarcho-syndicalism and our theme for today, Libertarian Socialism, interchangeably with anarchism. Is there a difference between these terms, and if so, can you describe the differences?
Well, first of all, anarchism covers a very wide range. I mean, what you just quoted seems to me like a kind of a core principle of anyone who's involved anywhere in anarchist movements should at least accept that authority is not self-justifying. Hierarchic institutions, authoritarian structures, structures of dominance and control have a burden of proof. I mean, they're not self-justifying. They have to meet a challenge. They should be challenged. And I think that everyone ought to be an anarchist in that sense. It doesn't carry any, then come further questions about what you do about it. But it ought to be challenged, and if it can't meet the burden of proof, which is usually the case, though not always, then they should be dismantled. This should be done everywhere, from families to international affairs, professions, science, whatever it is. Actually, it's kind of striking that in some domains it's just taken for granted. Like in the sciences, if you're science students, it's assumed that the task for students is to challenge. You're not supposed to just copy what you heard. The fields would die if they did. So you're supposed to challenge, request, demand evidence and proof, and if you can't find it, change it. But that ought to extend to all of life. Now, Anarcho-syndicalism is a little bit different. That is a particular brand of anarchism, which was particularly concerned with things like workers' control by working people of production, the means of production, decisions over production. It's like a kind of a core part of it. That's the syndicalist part. Libertarian socialism is just the traditional word for anarchism. It's a French term originally, and so if you take a look at the French journals, Socialisme, Libertaire, they're just anarchist journals. It's the non-statist component of the anarchist tradition, and a lot of it was anarcho-syndicalist in character. So one of the main French writers, Daniel Guérin, has published major volumes on libertarian socialism. He's basically dealing with the anarcho-syndicalist variant of it. Of course, there are plenty of other things that call themselves anarchist. So this is by no means the whole story.
We're going to touch up on that a little later too. Libertarian socialists envision and work to create, predictably enough, libertarian socialist society. What would be the core features? What are the core features of that theory? What are the core features of that society?
Well, apart from accepting the general principle of anarchism, it tends to concentrate on the productive system. So, for example, workers' control in industry, control of other institutions by people who participate in them. It's not inconsistent with what's sometimes called communitarian anarchism, which concentrates on control of communities by participants. In fact, they generally, both groups think these ought to be integrated. It's a question of where the focus of attention is. But I don't think they're real conflicts. It's just a question of what's prioritized, what's the center of concern and activity, what other things will flow from it. Partly tactical choices, partly ideas about where the source of creativity, power, search for freedom would be in a society. You can have different views on that.
When we speak about anarchism, I'm sorry. When we talk about anarchism, it's often about people understand it as not being organized, as being a kind of chaos. But in fact, it's trying to find the institutions that can be effective but are minimally coercive. In a libertarian socialist society, what kind of institutions would that be?
Well, within the main libertarian socialist, especially anarcho-syndicalist tradition, what's assumed is it should be a highly organized society. It should be based on popular control at every level. So begins with, for example, control by working people of whatever institution they're working in, factory, offices, whatever it might be, and control of communities. And then these should be integrated through voluntary association. They could be regional. Then there should be federated structures that extend beyond, and on to organization of international society. But it should be highly organized, though controlled from below, not anything complex is going to have some degree of representative decision-making, but always under direct control and recall and so on. So it's kind of a, sort of pure democracy, if you want. In fact, the example, it takes the major achievement of mainly anarcho-syndicalist development was libertarian Spain, and it didn't have a lot of time. It was wiped out pretty soon, but it was what developed rather quickly was a fairly organized society with a lot of interaction between agriculture and industry and communities and so on. Pretty successful economically too.
That's interesting, because another challenge as a libertarian socialist when you're around and talking to people is the dominant idea that the current political and economic system is either joyously the end goal, or
either what?
Joyously the end goal, or more common, sadly without any real alternative. Is there no other way of organizing society, and are there real-life examples of libertarian socialist societies historically?
Well, there's no libertarian socialist society on any large scale that was able to withstand destructive attacks. So, for example, Spain, which was the most successful, it didn't arise spontaneously. which it's often described as the 36 revolution. It was in people's heads. There had been many experiments, many attempts, takeovers, a lot of them crushed by force. There had been anarchist educational programs for 40 years, which extended over a lot of the population. So when the opportunity came, people kind of had in their heads a picture of where it should go, and then implemented ideas that they had. As I said, it was they were fighting a war for one thing, and then they were under attack by their supposed allies. I mean, the movement was really destroyed by the communists. The famous May Day in 1937 was a communist-led attack on the anarchist structures and leadership. A lot of them were assassinated. The communists were the party of the petty bourgeois, the police, of course backed by the Soviet Union, which was just using this quite opportunistically. But during the period when this, and in fact communist armies went through the countryside destroying collectives, which were successful collectives. So yes, it didn't last. It didn't last against repression. It might have succeeded. There were interesting proposals as to how to fight the war. When the fighting was taken after what actually happened is if you look closely, during the revolution, the first year of the war, roughly 36, July 36 to May 37, there was just unity among over the entire global power system that this had to be destroyed. The communists were in the forefront, the fascists were there, the Western democracies were backing it. They all wanted to destroy this plague. It was too frightening. Not because there's no alternative, but because there is an alternative, and therefore you can't let it succeed. It's sometimes called a virus that would spread contagion if you allow it to survive. So it was crushed, but there were, and then the mostly communist-led government took over and fought a war against the fascists. But by that time, a lot of the popular support had eroded. I mean, people were involved in the revolution. They didn't care that much about who was going to pick up the pieces. And the Republicans finally were wiped out by the fascist forces. With the support of the Western democracies, I should say. It's a complicated story. There was one serious proposal as to how to fight the war, which was not implemented, but it might have worked. It's about the only thing that could have. That was from an Italian anarchist who was murdered by the communists on May Day, Camillo Berneri, who Italian anarchist activist, who proposed that instead of fighting a military battle against Franco, they should fight in part a guerrilla war in Spain, which is quite conceivable. You know, Spain has a long tradition of guerrilla warfare back to the Napoleonic conquests. But more significantly, they should fight a political war. Franco's armies were based in Morocco. They were Moorish armies. Now, there was a revolutionary movement going on in northern Africa, which was trying to, had a lot of facets, but one aspect was trying to break up the feudal structure, the landed estates, land to the peasants, and so on and so forth. And Berneri's suggestion was that the anarchists in Spain ought to support that, and that would, they thought, maybe rightly undermine the basis, the social base for Franco's armies. Now, of course, it would have utterly horrified France, England, the United States, anybody else who had any power. So you could imagine it'd be a huge, because it was undermining colonial control of North Africa. But it could have succeeded. Nothing else would have, and of course what was tried didn't. Are there other such things? Well, yes, there are germs of them all over the place. I mean, in the United States, a pre-conservative society, there are probably thousands of worker-owned, worker-run enterprises, some of them fairly substantial, some not. What typically happens is that they often are very successful, but it's embedded in a capitalist system. So if they are successful, what frequently happens is they're bought out. The workers are kind of bribed to sell them off. And it's pretty tempting. You get a substantial bribe from some big corporation, you know, why work the rest of your life? So that's, and that's happened over and over. And the reason is because they are successful. There are some, you know, there's some major worker-owned conglomerates. The main one is Mondragon in Spain, which didn't start from anarchist base, but from a kind of a Catholic left base. But it's huge. I mean, banks, industries, all sorts of things. But and it's worker-owned, but not worker-managed. It's a crucial difference. So they hire managers. And the managers operate within a capitalist framework. So Mondragon, while it's quite egalitarian internally, is expanding abroad to exploit cheap labor in Vietnam and so on and so forth. I mean, it's kind of hard to function in the broader society without while keeping to decent principles. But there are pieces of it all over the place, and they can be successful. And there are other things from it, like take say publicly controlled budgets, the kind of thing that one of the most famous places was Porto Alegre in Brazil. That's why the World Social Forum meets there. The first meetings of it, the local regional budget is determined by the public in public meetings, conferences, interactions, and that's been successful. There are a lot of these, if you like, anarchist experiments, and if they reach a sufficient scale, well, things can happen. Of course, they're always facing violent repression because they're very frightening to power systems. What happened in Spain is quite instructive. There was actually real cooperation among the Stalinists, the fascists, and the liberal democracies to crush this heresy.
Here in Norway, most people know of no other revolutionary strategies than the one you've just described, the ones named after dictators, Leninism, Stalinism, Maoism. In other words, only socialism, when you say socialism, that's what pops in their head. That's what they think of. What are the main differences between libertarian socialism and revolutionary state socialism?
Well, state socialism, in my view, is just a contradiction in terms. I mean, you can't have workers' control over production, which is, I mean, socialism also has a core notion, back to the beginnings in the 19th century. And the core notion is workers' control over production. That's very similar to anarchism, but at least that's the core. You can't have that if you have total state control. So, for example, by that standard, the United States was more socialist than Russia was. I mean, workers don't control production, but they have at least some influence. They can go on strike. They can part in Germany. There's co-determination and so on. Russia was zero. That was the least socialist country in the world. Maoist China was much more complex. Actually, a lot of rotten things happened. A lot of brutal things happened, but there were some pretty remarkable successes. Actually, there's a study which would be famous if it weren't for the conclusions that it came up with by Amartya Sen, who's a Nobel laureate, famous economist, who's a specialist on famines. He's Indian, and he did a study of one of his major conclusions. He's quite famous. His work's very well known and highly praised. One of his conclusions is that you don't get famines in democratic societies. He says he tries to show that the real, there's occasional things where it's just, all the crops die. But he points out, and he's right, that in most famines, there's plenty of food around, but it's not getting to people. And he's a lot of studies of this. And one of the striking cases is India, his native country, which had horrible famines under the British. millions of people died in the famines. And that went on until independence. Since independence, hasn't been a single famine. The country has the same ecology and everything else, but a different administration. And his point is that famines in a more or less democratic society, information flows and gets back to the authorities, the center, and then they can do something about it, if they want to. So India had no famine since 1947. Then he took a look at China, along with a colleague of his, an Indian economist. And of course, China had one horrible famine, 1958 to 60, in which maybe 30 million people died. Well, they point out, they consider that a political famine, and not because anything was planned, but because the society was so totalitarian that information about what was happening in the countryside never got back to the central decision-making system in time to do anything about it. So they correctly call that a political famine. Okay, that part of their work is known very well. But there's another aspect to the work which appears in the very same articles and is never cited. They compared mortality in India and China from independence, late 40s, up until 1970, 1980. They stopped in 1980 because that's when the so-called reforms were initiated in China, the liberal reforms. From 1949 to 1980, they calculate that about 100 million lives were saved in China as compared with India because of health programs, rural doctors, hygiene, distribution of the food in the countryside, and so on. That's even counting the Chinese famine. Even with that famine, 30 million killed, still China saved 100 million lives. Well, that's just, you can't say that, So people read the articles, but that half disappears somehow. It can't be that Maoist China saved 100 million lives as compared with democratic capitalist India. So that's kind of out of history, but it's there. And in fact, there was just a recent work on Chinese demography by American scientists who they didn't compare it with India, but they did study mortality rates, and it's quite striking. From 1949, in China independence, up till 1980, there's a very sharp decline in mortality, remarkable decline, through rural health programs, barefoot doctors, hygiene, teaching, and so on. In 1980, it stops. In fact, the death rate is now higher than it was in 1980. That's when the capitalist reforms began. Well, you can read that in science journals now, not in the general public. So it's a complex story, China, not so simple, but it certainly wasn't, there's almost nothing like socialism. So I would just say that state socialism is just a contradiction. You can't talk about it. So the only kind of socialism there is one or another variety of libertarian socialism.
Norway, the country in which we now sit, is considered to be one of the most successful social democracies in the world. Many things that working class people are struggling for in the United States, like proper health care and education, are available here to almost everyone. Should libertarian socialists in Norway simply shut up and enjoy the good life?
Should they?
Should they shut up and enjoy the good life? Is it time to kick back?
It's a better life than, say, 200 years ago in Norway, but you could say that about other things too. Take Niels Christie, the famous Norwegian criminologist. Well, just read his history of the penal system in Norway. It's from memory. I might get the details wrong, but up until, I think, the early 19th century, there wasn't much criminalization in Norway. They didn't bother putting people in jail. The reason was that if somebody was, say, suspected of shoplifting, you drive a stake through his hand. Okay, don't have to put him in jail. As things got somewhat more civilized, you start putting people in jail. Well, it's better to be in jail than have a stake driven through your arm, but that doesn't mean you should stop and enjoy life. And it's the same with this. I mean, it's better to have decent health care available than not, but that's not the end of life. And incidentally, although the Nordic countries are quite good in this respect, it's all over most of the world. I mean, Cuba, for example, which has an extremely poor country, it's under constant attack. Its per capita health expenditures, I think, are 5% of the United States, has the same health standards, because they put resources into it. The United States is kind of off the chart in healthcare. It's the only industrial country that doesn't have one or another variety of national health care. It has an unregulated, privatized system, the kind that there's no alternative Maggie Thatcher would like. And it's about twice the per capita costs of comparable countries and some of the worst outcomes. Everyone talks about the huge deficit in the United States and what a terrible problem it is. It's bringing down the global economic system. You take a look, you find out that if the United States had a healthcare system like other industrial countries, like, say, France or even Canada, which is not very good, or Norway, not only would there be no deficit, there'd be a surplus. I mean, it's a terrible drain on the economy and on the global economy because of the effect of a U.S. deficit on the global economy. And it's perfectly clear how to solve it. Like, it's not utopian to say, let's get a European-style healthcare system. That's not pie in the sky. But the power of the financial institutions is so enormous that it can't even be discussed. Actually, a majority of the population has been in favor of it for a long time, but it's called politically impossible or something, or lacking political support, meaning insurance companies won't allow it. And it's quite striking to see what Obama did. I mean, a lot of his support was, especially union support, which was quite important, not so much in votes, but just getting out the vote, activism, not the money. And getting him elected was based on the hope that he would institute national health care, which was his policy. Well, of course, that went out the window like in 5 minutes, not even any discussion. There was a residue left, namely a public option, that is to allow people the choice of picking a public program. He just gave that away, even though there was maybe, at least 2-to-1 support for it. But insurance companies wouldn't allow it. So yes, there are plenty of alternatives, even short term, and it would go beyond, of course, many more.
The Norwegian government, which calls itself Red-Green, is now conducting war in Afghanistan. It exports weapons. It's a major exporter of oil and thereby a major contributor to the global environmental catastrophe. And, we have benefits, healthcare, education. But if we put those aside, in Counterpower's analysis, this state is neither red nor green. Rather, it's a state which, instead of crushing capitalism, as is the right thing to do with it, is administering capitalism. It seems to me that we witnessed kind of the same thing from Stoltenberg's Norway to Blair's Britain, where just like the revolutionary state socialists, which are not socialists at all, the reformist ones, instead of crushing capitalism, is administering it. Would you agree with me that that means that state socialism, as it's called, either in its revolutionary or reformist variant, is ultimately a dead end for those that long for a future beyond capitalism? And what are the implications of that?
Well, I think you can drop the words beyond capitalism, those who yearn for a future. Because if you destroy the environment, there isn't going to be any future, And in fact, Norway is kind of an interesting contradiction because, by comparative standards, it's which are not very high, so it's not a great compliment. But by comparative standards, it's maybe one of the most humane states around. On the other hand, as you say, it's making a major contribution to ensuring that a human life isn't going to survive. it's not a joke. You take a look at the projections on, for example, the International Atomic Energy Agency a couple of months ago, I guess, came out with a conservative warning. They pointed out, just first of all, data that the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions had risen very sharply last year, despite the recession. So drop in production, but sharp increase in emissions. And they issued a warning that we're reaching the point, or maybe have even passed the point, which is kind of considered to be the threshold for doing anything to stop destructive climate change. That was, the scientific consensus is it's about 2 degrees centigrade warming. And they estimate that that's about where we are. So doing anything more may very well doom the species. So the phrase "after capitalism" is understated. There should be a real dilemma in countries like Norway about having a moderately decent life. Plenty wrong with it, but by comparative standards, fairly decent, at the cost of making sure that your grandchildren may not have any life at all.
All right. Well, if we don't believe in state socialism, then we have to find a way to build libertarian socialism. And we're going to talk a little bit about libertarian socialist organization. Now, libertarian socialists traditionally insist that the organizational structure of our organizations must prefigure the desired society. So, for instance, if we want a direct democratic society, then we should use direct democracy here and now. Why is that so important?
Well, the traditional idea goes back to Bakunin, is that the way to carry out social change is to build the seeds of the future within the present society. To try to, what's really involved in social progress ultimately is a kind of change of consciousness. Not just organization, but just letting different values and different concerns come to prevail. And the way that happens is through participation and action, not by reading about it. And one of the ways to do it is to start with direct democracy where you are. And and there are a lot of ideas about how to do this. Work sharing, lots of decision-making, common decision-making, and that helps. It's essential. I agree with this. It's essential for gaining an understanding of what a free democratic society might be like, even if it's a small group, let's say a publishing house with 10 people. And you learn, you experiment, you see what works, what doesn't work, you can go on to bigger things. But that's to get back to Spain. That's why the revolution was able to take place over such a broad part of the country and so quickly. There had been plenty of things like that crushed, but they'd been tried. It goes on all the time. That's what's happening right now in the Arab Spring. Not libertarian socialism, but something similar. If you take there's been a couple of studies of this. There's a very close correlation in the Arab world between the success of the uprising and the history of labor militancy. Very closely correlated. So Tunisia and Egypt, the two places where there's been some successes, have quite a long history of very significant labor militancy. In fact, in Egypt, as you may know, the January 25th uprising is called the April 6th movement. Well, in the West, nobody knows why, but in Egypt, they know why very well. April 6th, 2008, was the date of a major labor action, one of many, but supposed to be a really big one, centered in the biggest industrial conglomerate in Egypt, the Mahala textile plant. It's designed to take place all over the country with supporting activities, popular activities, and so on. That was April 6, 2008. Well, it was crushed by the dictatorship. with the backing of the West, of course. But they remember. And in fact, there was a long series of such actions, some of them somewhat successful, others, some of them crushed. And the current uprising really took off when the labor unions joined. And in fact, they're the ones, they've gained a lot. I mean, the military regime is still in place, but there is effective labor organizing. They're, for the first time, able to develop a non-state union, which they've been trying to do for years, raise minimum wages, and in some places, there's actual worker takeover of industries. That's going, and something similar was true in Tunisia. They also had a militant labor union. The places that didn't have them are nothing much is happening. But this is kind of an example of what you were raising. When you have the experience of carrying out cooperative actions for socially progressive purposes, then you have a basis for going on when the occasion arises.
If one was to build a libertarian socialist organization, what would be the core features of it? What would be the core elements?
Well, core elements, first of all, would be authentic participation. That means everybody, not one person's a secretary, one person's a janitor, one person does the finance, and therefore you kind of automatically get a hierarchy of decision-making based on a role in the system. But really participating. That doesn't mean everybody can do everything. Like, I can't be a surgeon, somebody else can. But it means that in anything that involves decision-making functions, it should really be shared. It should be true in, say, universities, like where I am, or publishing houses, or factories, or anywhere else. That's the beginning. And as soon as you do that, it just breaks down barriers among people. For one thing, it means, there is some kinds of work that nobody wants to do, but has to be done. Well, that has to be shared. If that's not shared, then you got a problem. But that can be instituted. A joint participation, decision-making can be instituted. If there is representation, immediate recall when under public, cooperative action. All of these things can be instituted on a very small scale and can spread to larger ones. And that, if it goes far enough, becomes a major organization.
In the United States...
Actually, there's some very specific proposals about this.
Yeah?
So if you, I don't happen to agree with all of them, so I'm not particularly advocating it, but if you take a look at the participatory economic movement, PowerCon they call it, there are extremely detailed proposals about how to proceed with this. And I think they're kind of worth thinking about. Things I don't agree with, but debating them, maybe changing them, and so on. But it's a pretty live movement all over the world, incidentally. My friend Michael Albert, who is kind of at the center of this right now, is in Turkey, talking to people doing popular organizing in the Kurdish areas, Diyarbakir.
More water? Oh.
Oh.
Better? All right. Yeah.
What?
Can you talk a little bit?
Am I not talking loud enough? Sorry. Too much talking. I've been talking solidly for 3 days. Yeah.
Would you like some more water?
Sure. That's enough, thanks.
All right, moving on. In the United States, a large part of those who proclaim themselves anarchists have a very individualistic perspective, like CrimethInc, for example. Like CrimethInc, for example. That's a tendency here, too. How do we move people from chanting slogans or non-participation in society to organized action?
Proceed to do it. Set up the... yes, it's in the... Especially in the English-speaking world, libertarian has a different meaning that it had on the continent or historically. It means ultra-capitalist. So the people who call themselves libertarians in the United States, the libertarian movement, are, there are aspects of, people like Ron Paul, people like that. Some of the things that they propose, I think are okay, but what they're basically advocating, although they don't know it, is pure corporate tyranny, just the exact opposite of liberty. And that's based on a certain notion of freedom, which says people should be free to do whatever they want. Okay, you have that. Then people who have resources, capital, they'll hire other people, they'll hire their own armies, they'll build their own roads, and you go on to some indescribably horrible form of private tyranny. That's a particular pathology, I think that's the word for it, particularly in the United States and in England. But and if you have that here, I think people have to be talked out of it by thinking through what the consequences are, what it means in terms of any authentic notion of liberty and freedom. But it's kind of like arguing with neo-Nazis. How do you organize them? Well, get them to think about what they're doing and what the alternatives are.
Well, that's not our approach, actually. Libertarian socialists obviously must take some of the blame for our lack of influence. We have been poorly organized. For instance, our own organization, Counterpower or Motmakt, only recently began organizing. Another reason could be that state socialism held a firm grip on the revolutionary left since the Russian Revolution in 1917, but after its collapse in 1989, the state socialist parties have been in a permanent crisis. Would you agree with me that the time we're living in, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, could be a unique historic opportunity if libertarian socialists start to organize and build strong organizations? Could we become the most important ideology for those that seek fundamental change?
Well, that's sort of what I was hoping myself in the late 80s. In fact, around late 80s sometime, one of the, I won't mention the name, but a well-known left journal, a socialist journal, asked me to write an article on the Soviet Union. So the article, you can find it, it was called The Soviet Union versus Socialism. And what I was arguing is that the Bolshevik Revolution was the worst blow against socialism that had taken place in the 20th century, partly because it did appropriate. If you take a look at what happened then, there were two major propaganda systems in the world. One huge one based in the state capitalist democracies, another smaller one growing out of the Bolshevik Revolution. And they disagreed on a lot of things, but they agreed on one thing, that the Soviet Union, Russia at first, was socialist. I mean, the Leninists wanted to insist on that so that they could benefit from the sort of moral commitment to socialist values which spread all over the place. So if they became the leaders of socialism, they'd benefit from that. The state capitalist system insisted on it because they wanted to defame socialism. So when the two major propaganda systems in the world agree on something, it's kind of hard for people to extricate themselves from it. And in fact, that settled in. This is socialism. As it started to decay finally in the late 80s, it looked like there'd be an opportunity. I should say that this article, the journal refused to publish it, and it finally ended up being published in Our Generation, an anarchist journal in Montreal. But it just was kind of, it wasn't so much censorship that couldn't be understood, because the idea is so embedded that what grew out of the Bolshevik Revolution is maybe distorted socialism. There's nothing like that. I mean, you take a look at when Lenin and Trotsky took over, for what they considered good reasons, they very quickly dismantled all of the socialist institutions which had arisen during the revolutionary period. During the it goes way back, but from February 1917 right up to October, there was a lot of activism in Russia, popular activism, factory councils, Soviets, all sorts of things. And they wanted to get rid of that very quickly, and did. It was crushed. You had to have what they called a labor army under the command of a single leader. And there's an ideology behind it. It wasn't just the ideology. It was a kind of it's their version of Marxism. I don't think it had much to do with Marx, but their version was that you can't have a socialist revolution in Russia, which was a poor, very poor, mainly agricultural society. First, you have to drive the population to industrialization, and then after that, the iron laws of history will begin to work, and so on. So to drive them to industrialization, you had to destroy all of the true socialist institutions that had developed, like factory councils and Soviets. They were pretty quickly dismantled. Of course, the convention was dismantled because that was going to be taken over by the radical peasant movements, and peasants can't be radical according to their view. They're not Marx, incidentally. But that just crushed socialism very quickly.
When we talk about these two, the state capitalist democracies and the authoritarian communist regimes, one of the things that comes up a lot is, as a libertarian socialist, is I think a lot of the common doubts or questions when it comes to any anarchy. Oh, I think I've already asked this question.
You get a different answer.
Oh, okay. Yay. All right. Well, I'll try another one then. An often heard objection against a libertarian socialist society is that no one would bother to work in it. You think that's a valid objection? What about those that don't want to work?
Well, it's an interesting concept. Actually, this is one of the things in which I've differed for some time on with the Paracon people. They basically have the same view. Mike Albert, Robin Hannell, and the others. We've disagreed about this for many years. It's a question of what you think work is. I mean, there is a point of view associated with capitalist systems that holds that work is a burden. If you weren't driven to work, you'd prefer to vegetate. I don't think that has anything to do with human beings. And in fact, it's kind of striking that the people who hold this view, most of them come from the university or scientific backgrounds. Well, you go into, say, the university where I work, MIT, mainly scientific university, and people are working 80 hours a day, 80 hours a week, because they love their work. And their work is under their own control. Of all the social institutions, these especially science-based universities are places where you really do control your own work. I mean, you got to meet some conditions, but it's pretty much controlled by participants. So, optimally and in fact often realistically. And under those conditions, people just want to work. The carpenters who love what they're doing and can control it, they work all the time. And in fact, there's an old tradition from the Enlightenment, which grew into classical liberalism and finally anarchism, which holds that work should be one of the highest ideals of life. Creative work under your own control. And I think most people know that that's true. When you have an opportunity to do creative work under your own control, especially if it has some social purpose and so on, it's the best thing to do. It's a lot better than lying on a couch and watching a boring television program. So I just think it's it's a concept of work that comes out of capitalist ideology, which says people have to be driven to work. Actually, it's very interesting to watch the debates about this. It's debated in mainstream circles, not so much in these terms, but take a look at the debates about taxation of the wealthy. The standard argument against taxing the wealthy is, well, if you put high taxes on the wealthy, they're not going to do anything. And they're the ones who invest and make things happen and so on and so forth. Now, the people who press this most are economists, and sometimes it's almost comical. There was an article, one of the major journals, by a well-known Harvard economist, liberal economist, Greg Mankiw, wrote the major texts, and he argued, he said, look, you can't, he's kind of a liberal, he says you can't tax the rich because they're not going to do anything. And then there's no economic theory behind it or any other theory, but he gives an example of himself. He says, well, if I didn't have a high salary, I wouldn't do anything. You'd never get anyone in a university saying that except from an economics department. And that's because the ideology is so built in, they can't think. They can't look at the next office and see that the guy's in the lab all day because he loves what he's doing. Of course people want to do meaningful work, especially if they can run it themselves. The Paracon position that I've disagreed with is they believe that remuneration ought to be proportional to input. The harder you work, the more you should be paid. But I think that's a very demeaning conception of not only of what work is, but what human beings are like. And I don't even think it's true. In fact, they themselves work very hard and they don't get paid for it. So are they different from other people?
Could you talk a little bit more about you've often said that your views, which are based in classical liberalism, and often the same texts that that libertarians in the American sense use to justify capitalism.
No, they don't. They use the names, but not the writings. And it's very interesting to look at them. Like, say, take Adam Smith, the great hero. I'm sure you've all read some of Adam Smith. But if you actually look at what he wrote, it's totally different. So take, say, the concept of invisible hand. Everybody's heard of the invisible hand. It's used once in Wealth of Nations, so it's pretty hard to miss. And what it is a critique of neoliberalism, literally. What he points out is he's not a fool. He pointed out that he's talking about England. That's his topic. He says if in England merchants and manufacturers, people who sort of ran the country, if the manufacturers decided to produce abroad outside of England, and if merchants decided to import from abroad, they would profit, but the society would be seriously harmed. In our terms, he's saying neoliberal globalization will harm the society. And then how do you get around it? Well, he got around it by a kind of a sentimental argument. He said that the merchants and manufacturers will have what's sometimes called a home bias. They would prefer to manufacture at home and purchase at home because of the commitment to the home society. And therefore, as if by an invisible hand, England will be saved from the ravages of what we call neoliberal globalization. Take a look. You can find it easily. There's one occurrence. Take a look at the index of any work. That's the context. And incidentally, David Ricardo, the other major founder of classical economics, he drew the same conclusion. He recognized that his famous principle of comparative advantage wouldn't work if, again, it's kind of England and Portugal, it's the case he's studying, if the manufacturers in England decided, okay, we want to produce everything in Portugal because we make more money that way, and the merchants in England said, okay, we'll import everything from Portugal because it's cheaper. He said England will be destroyed. But then he said he the same as Adam Smith, he says, well, he expects that the rich in England will have enough commitment to their own society so that they won't do this. They'll accept a lower rate of profit in England than they could get in Portugal. And then he ends up saying, I hope that these ideas will never disappear, because if they did, we'll be in real trouble. Well, that's classical economics. You don't learn that in an economics class. In fact, well, I don't have to tell you what you learn because you know. And it's that way right across the board. I mean, take, say, division of labor. Everybody's read or been taught the first paragraph of Wealth of Nations, where the butcher does this, and the baker does that, and they do it for their own profit, and we all benefit. We should have division of labor. So division of labor is a wonderful thing. You go on and read a couple hundred pages into the book at Wealth of Nations, and Smith has a lengthy discussion of division of labor, and it's very closely related to this matter of work. Remember, he was an Enlightenment figure. He's growing out of the Enlightenment. He says division of labor, in any civilized society, the government is going to have to intervene to prevent division of labor, because it's going to turn people into creatures as stupid and ignorant as a human being can possibly be. It's going to lead to people doing rote work under control, external control, and doing it because that's the way labor is divided. It's going to destroy people. People, their highest goal is creative work under their own control. So you have to block division of labor. That passage is so intolerable to, it's a little bit like Amartya Sen's work on India and China. It can't be read. In fact, if you look at the scholarly edition, that bicentennial of Wealth of Nations, the University of Chicago, main supposedly classical liberal department, published a scholarly edition of Wealth of Nations. You take a look at the index. It doesn't even give an index entry for this discussion of division of labor. It's just too unacceptable. And of course, nobody reads Adam Smith's discussion of the masters of mankind and how they pursue their vile maxim, all for ourselves and nothing for anyone else, and how awful this will be. I mean, there's a lot. I'm not extolling Adam Smith particularly, but if you take a look at the actual text, it's not the way it's presented. So I think it's correct to say that classical liberalism was it grew out of the Enlightenment, and it's the source of not only the anarchist movement, but even Marx drew from that same tradition, the same tradition about work, for example. And in fact, the early Marx manuscripts read very much like classical liberals, von Humboldt, Smith, and others. He's coming from exactly the same background. I kind of agree with Rudolf Rocker, who was one of the main anarcho-syndicalist intellectuals and historians, who argues that classical liberalism, as he put it, was wrecked on the shoals of capitalism. It was pre-capitalist. And when capitalism came along, that was the end of classical liberalism, and the anarchist tradition grew out of it and emphasized the positive elements of it. So it's true that they do cite Adam Smith and classical liberalism, but are strongly opposed to it. I mean, this is all over the place. Take about a century ago in the United States, and increasingly in the other state capitalist systems, that corporations were given extensive rights, given the rights of persons in particular. Back about a century ago, there were conservatives. By now, this is the name, but it doesn't exist. And conservatives bitterly opposed this because it's an attack on the fundamental principles of classical liberalism, that rights inhere in persons, not in organic entities created by state power. They don't have rights. But that's the way our so-called liberal societies work now. These organic entities have rights, enormous rights, in fact, greater than the rights of persons by now. Just totally inconsistent with classical liberal ideals.
I have one final question before we move over to some questions from the audience. It's a little cruel. If I have to force you to generalize, what would you say are the most important tasks for libertarian socialists today?
Usual task, create real libertarian socialist movements. and then you can proceed to do a lot of things that ought to be done, from carrying out the kinds of reforms of existing society that are very badly needed, up to creating the germs of a future society and your own lives and activities, and then expanding them. But there's no particular thing to pick. I mean, if you take a look at say maybe the oldest anarchist journal in the English-speaking world, at least, Freedom in England. If you read the articles in Freedom, they range from how to deal with, how to get involved in particular crucial social struggles that are taking place right now. Let's say onerous tuitions for English students, which are going to wipe out opportunities for the poor to go to school, the crushing of strikes, whatever ecological issues, whatever it may be, up to designing and trying to implement parts of a future society. A whole range of things is there, and there's plenty of it. I mean, and some of them are really critical. Like the human species is in a very unique stage of its history. We're at a stage where we can destroy ourselves. And in fact, it's almost inevitable the way things are now structured. Partly nuclear war, which is always imminent, and the threats are getting worse. It's a kind of a miracle humans have survived. And the other is environmental destruction. And unfortunately, the environmental destruction is virtually an imperative in existing societies. It's part of the state capitalist system. They have to move towards environmental destruction, not because they're bad people, but because it's a requirement. I mean, if you're the CEO of a corporation, you may be the nicest guy in the world. You may be giving away all your money to the environmental movement on your own. But in your role as CEO of a corporation, you are compelled to maximize profit and to ignore what economists call externalities. That is, the impact of your transactions on others. Well, that's why we have repeated financial crises ever since Reagan and Thatcher. The deregulation of the financial institutions means that the people who run them have to ignore what's called systemic risk, the risk that a transaction is going to bring down the system. And since you ignore it, you're increasing the probability of it, and therefore it repeatedly happens. So we repeatedly have financial crises, each one worse than the last, ever since around 1980, when Reagan and Thatcher began. There's no alternative. But in that case, financial crises, well, there's a kind of a remedy. The taxpayer can come along, the state can come along and rescue the financial institutions, which is what just happened and is going to happen in Europe pretty soon as Greece defaults. But in the case of when you ignore one of the externalities is survival of the species, and nobody's going to come along and rescue and pay off that one. So you're doomed, basically. If we keep the current system, we're doomed. And that's, Norway has a particular case of it to think about. Should we produce oil and have a rich society? But it's a problem for everyone. It's inherent in state capitalist institutions. And those are really big problems. I mean, those are problems about literal species survival. And beyond that, there are problems of justice and freedom all over the place. So there's no shortage of tasks. I mean, I don't see any point listing them.
Let's give him a hand, folks. Great.
Ok, som jeg sa innledningsvis, er det 3 personer her I kveld som har blitt valgt ut til å stille hvert sitt spørsmål til Chomsky. Skal vi se, de sitter... Vi starter med et spørsmål fra Johannes Bennetsen.
Tusen takk, skal vi se. Fint. I have a question. let's see. In the mid 1970s, many people argued in the West that in the mid 70s, many people in the West thought that Marxism had a reasonable case to argue. But in the mid 1980s, many of them no longer considered that it had. What exactly happened? Did it turn out that it was all just a big joke?
Well, I think what happened is what you brought up before. Marxism was associated with the Soviet Union and Maoist China and other so-called communist systems. But, you know, Marx would have turned over in his grave to see what they were doing. They were radically anti-Marxist, radically. But as long, like take, say, the way the Bolsheviks, Lenin and Trotsky, decided they had to drive the backward peasantry to industrialization by force in order to lead ultimately to a socialist society. I mean, the last 20 or 30 years of his life, Marx was working on peasant society in Russia. There were the Narodniks, you know, the urban intellectuals went out to the countryside to collect information, to figure out how the peasants are living, and so on and so forth, try to assist them in things. And they collected tons of data. And Marx was just poring over the data. And he became convinced that there's real revolutionary potential in peasant society, peasant communes, peasant cooperative tradition, and so on. The urban socialists, both the Bolsheviks and the Social Democrats, literally suppressed all that work. It was just too inconsistent with their own class interests of, you know, controlling social movements. So that was gone. And the same is true across the board. I mean, I'm not, again, kind of like Adam Smith, you can't worship Marx, but he had things to say. And what he had to say, what he believed, was utterly inconsistent with what are called the communist socialist movements. Even more the communist than the social democratic ones. After all, he believed that in England, you know, that's the social democratic society of his day, that there could be a parliamentary road to communism. But, you know, because there was enough participation of the public in decisions. But in any event, once you associate Marx with Russia, and it's clear that Russia is becoming a disaster, as was becoming clear by the 80s, well, of course, then you have to say, let's give up Marx. And I think that's essentially what happened.
Thank you.
Ok, neste spørsmål fra Sveinung Legård. Det deg.
Thank you very much for an interesting conversation. I wanted to touch upon one of the last things you were talking about tasks for libertarian socialists today, and you said there is a range of tasks that has to be done, for example, carrying out reforms that are necessary in today's world. So my question is, how do you do that without ending up just being reformist? A few years ago you had an interview series that was entitled Expanding the Floor of the Cage. So how do you expand the floor of the cage without, well, accepting the cage?
You don't accept it. You expand the floor of the cage. That was a phrase taken from rural workers' movements in Brazil, where they say, yeah, we're in a cage. But we can't. We're in the cage. We can't deny that we're there. We have to expand the floor of the cage, so then we can break out of it. And yes, that's the way we should expand the floor of the cage. Expand the floor of the cage too, with the goal of breaking out of it once we've created the basis for going beyond. You don't have to be caught up in the existing structures of power in order to try to, while you're trying to improve them. That's a step towards dismantling them. So I don't think it's by any means impossible. I mean, the same is true of, say, the Spanish anarchist revolution. It began for years with trying to create collectives within the quasi-feudal, quasi-capitalist system. And that made sense. And then when they had a chance, they broke out of it.
Okay, our third and final question for tonight is from Martin Ravneberg.
There has been real public demands and mobilization for political change in Eastern Mediterranean countries like Egypt and Tunisia. Well, we saw this demonstration spread to the western part of the Mediterranean, like Greece and Spain. Same kind of mobilization, a lot of rage. But we see only what I would classify as mildly reformist concrete alternatives coming out of this, like the reform of the election law in Spain. Why are we not able to transcend our current notion of Western democracy, and to what extent do you think theory is necessary to create a viable public alternative to the current status?
Well, theory is a kind of a fancy word. It makes you think of physics or something like that. I mean, we should have ideas and principles and things that you debate and discuss as concrete things. For example, in a future society, should remuneration be contingent on effort, as Paracon insists, and I think that's wrong. Those are things which we should discuss and think about. I don't see any point using an inflated term like theory to discuss this. It's mostly common sense. Not enough is understood about humans or societies to have far-reaching theories from which you can draw conclusions that mean much. But yeah, you should think about what you're doing, think about the consequences. In that sense, of course, you should have theories. Why haven't these movements gone far enough in Spain and Greece? Well, they're facing very immediate problems. Greece is facing the problem of destruction of the society. Spain, it's not quite that bad, but it's not that far off. And the popular movements, I think, are pretty impressive, especially in Greece, as far as I can see. They haven't formulated sets of operable demands. In Spain, they have, like the programs that are coming out of the indignados, are feasible. They could be implemented in Spain, and if they do, they could make a difference, and you could go on for more. But that goes back to your questions. But do we have to get caught up in reformism? No, you don't have to be caught up in it. You have to see it as a step towards something else.
All right. Well, I actually think we have time for one more question, so don't clap yet. Could raise your hands. And does anybody have one more question? Don't be shy. Yeah.
What does remuneration mean?
What does remuneration mean?
Oh,
that means pay.
Pay, basically. Yeah.
Remuneration is pay.
Yeah. Shouldn't use fancy words.
Jeg kommer bakover, så får dere mikk. Okay, si navnet ditt.
My name is Eirik Finne. I'm a student at the Faculty for Humanities at the University of Oslo. I have a question regarding the Middle East and the uprisings there. Do you see any chances for kind of collective socialist movement in, for example, Egypt? As Egypt is a very remote country with a spread population, that somewhere kind of Ismailia, the Sinai, that larger groups can, and organization can form there.
Well, it's an interesting question. We really don't know, but I mean, it is significant, I think, that within the workers' movement, which again is a militant movement with a long history of activism, they are moving partly towards authentic libertarian socialist structures, like worker takeover of industry. They're ahead of us in that respect. And that's important. I mean, whether it'll succeed, well, who knows? They're facing very powerful barriers. It is a military regime. The West is going to do anything it can to prevent even formal democracy in these areas for perfectly obvious reasons. I mean, I don't know about here, but in the Western countries I know of, there's some things you just can't report. One of the things you can't report, although they're certainly known, is the studies of attitudes of the public in the Arab world. Very careful studies done by the most prestigious American polling institutions, and they're released publicly by Brookings Institute and people like that. And it's obvious that planners know those results, even though the press won't report them and people don't know. And what they show explains exactly why the Western countries will do anything they can just to prevent even formal democracy in these countries. You just take a look at the attitudes. So take, say, Egypt, which you mentioned, also the most important country. I mean, in Egypt, about 90% of the population think that the major threat that they face is the United States and Israel. Iran, maybe 10% think it's a threat. In fact, opposition to U.S. policy is so strong that in Egypt, 80% think that the region would be better off if Iran had nuclear weapons to counter U.S. power. And it goes on from there. I haven't seen a percentage, but there's overwhelming opposition to the way in which the Egypt-Israel treaty has been interpreted by the dictatorship. They don't want to go to war, but the treaty has been interpreted by the dictatorship, former dictatorship, as neutralizing Egypt so that there's no deterrent when Israel invades Lebanon, as they did immediately after the treaty was formed, or expands in the West Bank and so on. And the population is very angry about that. And surely the United States and its allies don't want these attitudes translated into policy, which was what would happen if you had democratic societies. And when you get things like workers' takeover of factories, the opposition is going to be even stronger. That's an idea that can spread. And if it spreads, the whole structure of power begins to unravel. So they're going to face plenty of barriers, but they're doing things. In fact, they're doing more than we're doing. And we should be ashamed of that.
All right. Thank you very much. We have... Keep clapping.